How did you handle all that? How did your ego deal with all that?
Very well. Unlike all the stories you hear about it,
When the news broke that Gene Wilder had passed away, it didn't feel like the loss of a celebrity. It felt personal. For millions, he wasn't just an actor. He was a presence tied to childhood memories, quiet laughter, and moments when life felt lighter. From Willy Wonka's strange kindness to the manic brilliance of Young Frankenstein, Gene Wilder had a way of making humor feel human. But as tributes poured in, something stood out. His death was peaceful, his legacy celebrated. Yet the woman who knew him best remained silent. No interviews, no public statements, no explanations. People assumed there was nothing more to say. But behind the warmth and laughter was a life shaped by pain, discipline, and secrets few ever knew. And years later, when his wife finally chose to speak, what she revealed changed how many people understood Gene Wilder forever. Because the man who made the world laugh had spent much of his life hiding deep emotional battles of his own. And that story began long before Hollywood ever knew his name. But to understand that silence, you have to go back to the very beginning. To the public, Gene Wilder was gentle chaos wrapped in warmth. His wide eyes, nervous energy, and soft-spoken intensity made him unforgettable. He could scream in one moment and whisper wisdom in the next. Audiences believed they understood him because his performances felt honest. But that honesty was carefully controlled. Gene was deeply private, almost guarded. He avoided fame culture, disliked interviews, and rarely spoke about his past unless absolutely necessary. While others chased attention, Gene pulled away from it. Even during his biggest successes, he resisted becoming a Hollywood personality. That wasn't humility, it was protection. The truth is, Gene didn't see comedy as fun. He saw it as survival. Laughter wasn't something he chased, it was something he learned to use. And the gap between who he was on screen and who he was off screen was far wider than anyone realized. Because while audiences saw joy, Gene carried memories he never fully escaped. And those memories were formed in a childhood that demanded strength far too early. Gene Wilder was born Jerome Silverman in Milwaukee in 1933, the son of Jewish immigrants who had fled hardship in search of stability. That stability didn't last long. When Gene was just 8 years old, his mother fell seriously ill with rheumatic fever, a condition that weakened her heart and changed the atmosphere of their home forever. Doctors gave young Gene an unusual instruction: make her laugh. They believed joy might help her survive. For a child, that responsibility was enormous, and Gene took it seriously. He learned early that laughter could ease pain, not just for others, but for himself. Acting wasn't a dream at first. It was a duty, a way to hold his family together. When he later watched his sister perform on stage, something clicked. Performance wasn't just expression, it was control. It was safety. And Gene wanted more of it. Believing her son needed discipline and opportunity, Gene's mother sent him to a military-style school in California. What she hoped would strengthen him did the opposite. Gene was isolated, targeted, and treated as an outsider for being Jewish. The experience left deep emotional scars that followed him for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about it, even decades later. Instead, he internalized everything. Pain became something to manage quietly. Humor became a shield. Gene learned how to appear composed while feeling unsafe inside. This wasn't something that disappeared with age or success. It shaped how he trusted people, how he loved, and why he kept parts of himself hidden even from those closest to him. When he finally left the school and returned home, theater became more than passion. It became refuge, and that refuge would soon become the foundation of his entire identity. Back in Milwaukee, Gene immersed himself in local theater. For the first time, he felt seen for something other than his differences. At 15, he performed in front of a paying audience, and the reaction changed him. Applause wasn't validation, it was relief. On stage, Gene controlled the moment. He chose when people laughed, when they listened, and when they felt something real. That power mattered to someone who had once felt powerless. He carried that discipline into college, studying theater and communication with intense focus. He wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing mastery. Even then, Gene stood apart from his peers, quiet, observant, relentlessly prepared. Every role was treated seriously, even when the material was light. Because for Gene Wilder, comedy was never accidental. It was crafted, and that mindset would soon lead him far beyond Wisconsin, straight into a future he never could have predicted. And with that leap, Jerome Silverman would disappear. By his mid-20s, Jerome Silverman understood a hard truth about Hollywood. Names mattered. His didn't sound like someone audiences would remember, let alone admire. So he changed it. Gene came from a character he admired in literature. Wilder honored playwright Thornton Wilder, whose work carried emotional weight beneath simple words. The new name wasn't about fame. It was about control. With it, Gene felt he could finally step into the version of himself he had been building for years. He threw himself into stage work, refining his timing, his voice, and his restraint. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was sloppy. Every performance was measured, intentional. He wasn't loud like other comedians. He was precise, and that precision set him apart long before the cameras found him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the real life behind the legend, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps keep these untold stories alive. And here's a question for you. Do you think great comedians are born from joy or from pain? Because the next person Gene met would change his career forever. While performing on Broadway, Gene landed a role in the play Mother Courage and Her Children. That's where fate quietly intervened. One of his co-stars was Anne Bancroft, already respected and connected in Hollywood. She noticed Gene immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't. His intensity was controlled, his presence understated. Bancroft introduced him to her boyfriend, a sharp-witted comedian and filmmaker named Mel Brooks. The meeting was brief, but impactful. Brooks saw something rare in Gene, a performer who could make people laugh without begging for it. Before they parted, Brooks casually promised Gene a role in a future film. It sounded polite, almost dismissive. Gene didn't push. He didn't ask questions. He simply remembered the moment. Because in his experience, the quiet opportunities were often the real ones, and that promise would soon become very real. Gene's first step into film wasn't glamorous. In 1967, he appeared briefly in Bonnie and Clyde. The role was small, but the impact was not. Casting directors noticed him. Producers remembered his face. And suddenly, Gene was no longer just a stage actor. Then Mel Brooks kept his word. Gene was cast as Leo Bloom in The Producers, a nervous accountant unraveling under pressure. The performance was electric, vulnerable, completely unlike anything else on screen at the time. The film itself struggled initially, but Gene didn't. His portrayal earned him an Academy Award nomination and instant credibility in Hollywood. Overnight, he became someone studios paid attention to. But success brought a new problem: expectation. Now people wanted him to be funny on command, and that pressure sat heavily on someone who never saw comedy as a joke. Because fame didn't give Gene security, it gave him anxiety. After the producers, Gene could have taken safe roles. Instead, he wandered. He moved to Paris, experimented with unfamiliar projects, and avoided being boxed into a single image. One film led him to Dublin. Another left him creatively uncertain. He wasn't chasing hits. He was chasing meaning. Gene feared repeating himself more than failing. That fear pushed him toward strange scripts and risky choices. Some worked, others didn't. But every experience sharpened his instincts. He studied directors, pacing, and audience reactions. Behind the scenes, he was learning how films truly worked. While others celebrated their fame, Gene questioned it. He knew how quickly it could vanish, and he didn't want to be remembered for one good performance. Then came a role that would follow him for the rest of his life. In 1971, Gene auditioned for a strange, whimsical film called Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. He approached the role differently than anyone expected. Gene insisted that Wonka should feel unpredictable, charming one moment, unsettling the next. He even requested a physical gag at the character's first appearance to keep audiences off balance. The studio hesitated, but Gene stood firm. He understood something they didn't. Mystery creates power. When the film was released, it wasn't an instant success. Some critics didn't know what to make of it, but a few voices recognized its magic. Over time, the film grew into a cultural treasure, and Gene Wilder became the definitive Willy Wonka, a role that immortalized him. Even as it quietly trapped him inside an image he could never escape. And that tension would shape everything that came next. As Willy Wonka grew into a cultural phenomenon, Gene Wilder felt conflicted. The public adored the character, but Gene worried the role would define him too narrowly. Children saw magic, studios saw a brand, but Gene saw something else. A performance misunderstood as whimsy instead of intention. He had built Wonka as a layered figure, playful on the surface, calculating underneath. Yet Hollywood rarely looked past the candy-coated exterior. Offers came in, but many felt shallow, variations of the same eccentric role. Gene declined more scripts than he accepted, frustrating agents and studios alike. He wasn't difficult, he was selective. He feared becoming a parody of himself. And that fear pushed him back toward writing, toward ideas that let him control tone instead of being consumed by it. That need for control soon turned into a bold, creative gamble. Gene had always loved classic horror films, especially Frankenstein. But instead of fear, he saw absurdity. He imagined a film that honored the genre while gently mocking it, not loud, not crude, but precise. When he pitched the idea of Young Frankenstein, studio executives hesitated. A black-and-white comedy? In the 1970s? It sounded like career suicide. Even Mel Brooks wasn't convinced at first, but Gene believed in the concept deeply. He began writing anyway, pouring discipline and reverence into every page. This wasn't just a comedy to him, it was a statement, a way to prove that intelligence and humor could coexist. Slowly, momentum built. And once Mel Brooks came on board, the vision sharpened. But getting the film made would still require sacrifice, because creative freedom always comes at a price. Studios wanted guarantees, bigger budgets, broader jokes, color instead of black and white. Gene and Mel refused. They walked away from one deal after another until they found a studio willing to trust them. That trust came with strings attached, long contracts and personal risk. Gene accepted without hesitation. He believed young Frankenstein would either redefine his career or end it. On set, he was relentless. Every line mattered. Every pause had purpose. Cast members noticed his intensity. This wasn't ego. It was responsibility. When the film finally released, the reaction was immediate. Audiences loved it. Critics praised its intelligence. And Gene Wilder was no longer just a performer. He was a creative force. But success opened doors Gene never expected. Around the same time, Gene crossed paths with Richard Pryor. Their comedic styles couldn't have seemed more different. Gene controlled and restrained, Richard raw and explosive. But that contrast created magic. Gene saw Pryor as fearless, someone unafraid to say what others avoided. He insisted that Pryor be cast in Silver Streak, despite studio concerns. The risk paid off. The film became a hit, and Hollywood witnessed something rare: a comedy duo built on tension, respect, and timing. Together, they broke barriers without announcing it. Audiences felt the chemistry instantly. Behind the scenes, Gene admired Pryor's brilliance, but worried about his volatility. And that brilliance came with consequences no one could ignore. Their next film, Stir Crazy, was even bigger. It became one of the highest-grossing comedies of its time. On screen, the energy was effortless. Off-screen, it was complicated. Richard Pryor was battling personal demons, and the strain showed. Gene stayed patient, professional, and loyal, sometimes to his own detriment. He believed in protecting creative partnerships, even when they were difficult. The success solidified his status, but it also exhausted him. Comedy was no longer escape. It was obligation. And Gene began to crave something different, something quieter, something rooted in connection rather than chaos. That longing would soon lead him to the most important relationship of his life. By the late 1970s, Gene Wilder had everything Hollywood claimed mattered: hit films, critical praise, box office power. Yet privately, he felt increasingly disconnected. The industry wanted faster jokes, louder performances, bigger returns. Gene wanted nuance, silence, meaning. Each success brought more pressure to repeat himself, to recreate chemistry that couldn't be manufactured. Working alongside Richard Pryor had been exhilarating, but also draining. Gene absorbed tension quietly, never exploding, never complaining. That restraint took a toll. He began to question whether comedy was still saving him, or slowly wearing him down. He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't fulfilled. Something was missing, and without realizing it, Gene had started pulling inward, protecting his energy for something he couldn't yet name. That something arrived when he least expected it. Gene met Gilda Radner while filming Hanky Panky in the early 1980s. She was bright, fearless, and effortlessly funny, the opposite of Gene's controlled intensity. Yet beneath her energy was sensitivity he recognized instantly. They understood each other in ways words couldn't explain. What began as professional respect quickly deepened into connection. Gilda didn't laugh at Gene. She laughed with him. She saw past the persona, past the careful pauses, and into the vulnerable man underneath. For Gene, this was new. He had been admired, before even loved. But he had never felt truly understood. With Gilda, he felt safe, and that safety changed him. But love, for Gene, had never come without fear. Gene and Gilda married in 1984, choosing intimacy over spectacle. Their home became a sanctuary, filled with creativity, laughter, and dreams of a family. They wanted children deeply. When pregnancies ended in loss, they were devastated. Doctors offered no clear answers, only confusion and false reassurance. Gilda tried to stay strong, pushing through exhaustion and discomfort. Jean watched helplessly, sensing something wasn't right, but trusting the experts. As months passed, Gilda's symptoms worsened: swelling, fatigue, unexplained pain. Each visit brought more uncertainty. Still, they held on to hope. They believed love would carry them through whatever came next. But the truth would arrive suddenly and brutally. In 1986, Gilda Radner was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. By the time doctors discovered it, the tumor was already massive. The news shattered Jean. He had built his life around protecting others from pain. Now he could do nothing to stop it. Gilda underwent aggressive treatment, including surgery and chemotherapy. For a time, it worked. Remission brought cautious optimism. Jean cherished every ordinary moment, knowing how fragile happiness could be. But the reprieve was short-lived. The cancer returned quietly, without warning, and with it came a truth Jean couldn't escape. Love did not guarantee safety. The battle they fought together would soon reach its end. In 1989, Gilda Radner passed away at just 42 years old. Gene Wilder was inconsolable. He withdrew from the world, declining interviews, avoiding public grief. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted silence. Gilda had been his anchor, emotionally, creatively, spiritually. Without her, Gene felt untethered. Yet he refused to let her suffering mean nothing. He channeled his pain into action, dedicating himself to ovarian cancer awareness so others might be spared the same loss. Publicly, he grew quieter. Privately, the loss reshaped him forever. And in that silence, Gene Wilder disappeared from Hollywood. But not from life. After Gilda Radner's death, Gene Wilder did something Hollywood rarely understands. He stepped away. Not dramatically, not with announcements, he simply withdrew. Scripts arrived, offers followed, but Gene declined most of them. The industry assumed he was finished, or worse, broken. In truth, Gene was rebuilding himself quietly. He devoted time to ovarian cancer awareness, speaking not as a celebrity, but as a husband who had watched love slip away. He didn't exploit grief. He honored it. Gene also turned inward creatively. Writing became his refuge. He poured himself into novels, memoirs, and painting, finding comfort in work that didn't demand applause. Fame had once protected him. Now it felt unnecessary. He lived deliberately, choosing privacy over presence. Friends noticed a calmer version of Gene, gentler, softer, more reflective. He carried Gilda with him in everything he did, but he refused to let sorrow define the rest of his life. Still, love felt like something that belonged to the past, or so he believed, until someone unexpected re-entered his world. About a year after Gilda's passing, Gene reconnected with Karen Webb, a speech therapist he had met during the filming of See No Evil, Hear No Evil. At first, their conversations were simple, comfortable, unforced. Karen wasn't part of Hollywood, and Gene liked that. She didn't treat him like a legend. She treated him like a man. Slowly, trust returned. Gene was cautious, even afraid. Loving again felt like a betrayal of the past. But Karen understood that love didn't replace what came before. It expanded it. They married quietly in 1991, far from cameras and headlines. Together, they built a life rooted in calm routines, shared interests, and deep mutual respect. Gene found peace he hadn't known in decades. He no longer felt the need to perform, to explain, or to protect himself with humor. For the first time, he felt safe being ordinary. And that peace would matter more than anyone realized, because an invisible battle was already beginning. In the early 2010s, Gene Wilder was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis was devastating, yet Gene made a firm decision. He would not make it public. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want to be remembered as fragile or fading. He wanted the world to remember laughter. As the disease progressed, Karen became his anchor. She shielded him from confusion, frustration, and fear, quietly adjusting their lives to meet his needs. Gene never fully accepted what was happening. Some days, he seemed aware. Other days, he wasn't. But even as memory slipped away, his gentleness remained. He still smiled at music, still responded to warmth, still trusted Karen completely. For her, watching the man she loved slowly disappear was heartbreaking. But she never wavered. She chose presence over grief, devotion over despair. And in the final moments, love spoke louder than memory. On Gene Wilder's last night, he and Karen lay together listening to music. Ella Fitzgerald's voice filled the room, soft and familiar. Suddenly, Gene sat up and looked at her with clarity that hadn't surfaced in some time. He spoke gently. First, he said, "I trust you." Then he added the words every partner longs to hear, "I love you." Those were the last words Gene Wilder ever spoke. He passed away peacefully in 2016 at the age of 83. Karen later shared that moment, not for attention, but for truth. In the end, Gene wasn't a performer or an icon. He was a husband who loved deeply and trusted completely. Alzheimer's had taken his memories, but not his heart. And that, Karen believed, was the greatest gift of all. But Gene's story doesn't end with his passing. When the world remembered Gene Wilder, it celebrated comedy, the characters, the quotes, the unforgettable performances. But the fuller legacy is quieter. A man who turned pain into purpose, humor into healing, and love into action. He didn't chase fame. He endured it. He didn't demand admiration. He earned it. Gene Wilder showed that laughter doesn't erase suffering. It helps people survive it. His wife's long silence wasn't secrecy. It was protection. And when she finally spoke, it revealed a truth far more powerful than any headline. Gene Wilder lived gently in a loud world, and long after the laughter fades, that gentleness remains.